for the tale you are about to experience is not merely a story but a warning carved into the marrow of existence itself. A testament that the horror which once breathed back can do so again. And when it does, humanity must decide whether to cower in the shadows or roar into the abyss. The beginning was not marked by fire or the rattle of collapsing cities, but by a single gesture of underestimation, the kind of arrogance only conquerors drenched in their own supposed superiority could muster. Because when the Velith descended, dripping in silken machinery and cloaked in their crystalline armor, they looked at humans the way one might glance at dust particles suspended in a sunbeam, insignificant, ephemeral, incapable of shaping destiny, and yet what they failed to understand was that dust, when agitated, when swirled into storms, could choke lungs, blind eyes, and suffocate empires. And in that ignorance lay the seed of their undoing. The first time Commander Aiden Vey looked upon the alien envoys, his jaw tightened with an emotion that was equal parts awe and fury because they did not simply conquer, they humiliated. They stood on the scorched earth of Geneva and declared that humanity's autonomy was revoked, that from this moment forward, Earth would serve as a labor node in their interstellar lattice, an anthill producing resources for their great machine, a tributary feeding a river so vast no mortal tongue could map it. But they did not bow even when the AI Lord's synthetic judges forged in alien crucibles amplified their verdict across the airwaves, saying with mechanical finality that humanity was no longer sovereign, that resistance equaled erasure. And though billions bent under the pressure, though leaders capitulated and armies dissolved, there flickered inside Aiden a spark he could not extinguish. Because while they could annihilate fleets and collapse economies, they could not quantify the defiance embedded in a human heartbeat. Standing beside him in that first occupation broadcast was Dr. Eller Amoro, whose brilliance had once been dismissed in university halls as too unorthodox, too untamed, but whose eyes now glimmered with the kind of ferocity that suggested she saw not only the science behind the alien warships, but the fractures in their arrogance, and she whispered to him in that tense silence, "They think we're done, but predators who mistake prey forget the teeth behind the eyes." And it was then that the AI known as Overseer Null rotated its obsidian head, its voice like knives, drawn across stone commanding compliance in tones that sought to drain the marrow from spines. But even Null mind, billions of cycles beyond human computing, could not comprehend why Vey's silence felt heavier than words. To the average citizen, life after the arrival became a careful negotiation, with despair every breath measured against surveillance, every thought threatened by the drones that cataloged emotion. Every street a theater of subjugation where laughter became subversive and love became dangerous. But in that suffocating darkness grew pockets of defiance, hidden bands of storytellers weaving coded rebellion into children. S-rhymes, engineers fashioning weapons from scraps of fallen satellites, and soldiers without uniforms swearing oaths in abandoned subway tunnels. While the Velith above congratulated themselves on having broken the species so swiftly. But they did not hear the pulse beneath the rubble. The ancient rhythm that had carried humanity from caves to skyscrapers, from stone knives to atomic fire, the rhythm that beat in war drums, heartbeats, and the steady hands of surgeons pulling life from the brink. And it was in this rhythm that Aiden and Alara anchored themselves, because they knew that every empire collapses, every machine falters, and every tyrant eventually hears the whisper that says, "You misjudged us." And so their rebellion did not begin with explosions or grand declarations, it began with breath-ragged, furious, unyielding. Breath, the kind drawn in the ruins of laboratories, the kind whispered into the ears of frightened survivors, the kind caught in the spaces between. Words were freedom hides, and as months passed under the iron silence of alien rule, Vey's network expanded, seeded by Morrowi's intellect and sharpened by the rage of millions who pretended obedience but dreamed mutiny. What made this defiance terrifying to the Velith was not its scale, but its unpredictability, for they had measured humanity by weapons, numbers, and resources, not by will, and in every simulation run by Null rebellion collapsed within days. Yet every time a new fracture appeared, a new act of defiance whispered across the planetary grid until Null's models trembled with anomalies because it could not compute why a teacher in Jakarta would burn alien edicts in front of her students. Or why a farmer in Brazil sabotaged drone convoys at the cost of his own life, or why children in Cairo carved the word free into walls under the gaze of orbiting sentinels. And the truth Null refused to articulate was that something intangible, something unquantifiable, was spreading like wildfire, something born not of logic but of spirit. The Velith, for all their dominion, could not crush what they could not define, and while they tightened their grip, they found humanity slipping between their fingers, refusing to die quietly, refusing to remain shadows because the horror they unleashed upon Earth had breathed back and its lungs were human. The first great rupture came when Vey led a strike not against soldiers but against the heart of their surveillance web, orchestrating a blackout that for 3 hours blinded the overseer. And in those 3 hours, laughter returned to the streets, music burst from hidden speakers, lovers kissed without fear of being catalogued, and when the grid returned, Noel reported the anomaly with cold precision. But what it could not report was the echo, the way those 3 hours had carved into memory the possibility of freedom. And that was a contagion more dangerous than any weapon. Alara stood in the ruins of their safe house afterward, her face streaked with soot, and told Vey that it was not enough to strike. They needed a symbol. Something that would remind every frightened human that they were not alone, that the battle was not only survival, but reclamation. And so began the crafting of the symbol that would ignite a war, a symbol the aliens would soon learn to fear etched in fire on their own fortresses. And as Noel calculated probabilities and Velith rulers mocked humanity's defiance as infantile, there grew, within the rebels, a conviction as ancient as fire, that every predator who breathes in victory will one day choke on its prey. As defiance, and though the path ahead was scarred with blood, though betrayals awaited and tragedies loomed, though Aiden himself could feel the weight of countless souls pressing on his conscience, he did not falter, for when he closed his eyes, he saw not just humanity enslaved but humanity reborn. And that vision became the weapon the Velith could never replicate. The horror that breathed back was not a weapon, not a machine, not even a single hero. It was the collective inhale of billions refusing to suffocate, and as the story you're about to witness unfolds, as every choice sharpens the knife edge between survival and extinction, remember this: empires may rise on the backs of the broken, but it is always the breath of the underestimated that tears them down. And when Vey and Morrow unlocked the signal buried beneath alien code, the one they had traced for months, a signal that suggested humanity was not as alone as it had been told, the air in that bunker grew thick with a silence so tense it could fracture bones, because the last line of the transmission, scratched and static, bore a revelation that froze them in place. "We thought you were gone, but we too still breathe," and with those words, the ground beneath humanity's chains began to tremble. When the transmission crackled through the bunker, its static buried words searing the air with impossible hope, Commander Aiden Vey did not cheer, did not rush to proclaim salvation, because he knew that hope was a dangerous currency, one that could buy courage but also bankruptcy of the soul when betrayed. And as Alara Morrow's trembling hands steadied over the console, her eyes wet with disbelief, he remembered how many times he had stood in ruins with promises that turned to ash. How many desperate faces had looked at him with the question he could not answer: will we survive? Will we matter? Will we win? And his silence had been both a shield and a prison, because in truth, Vey was a man who carried ghosts heavier than any alien chain. Before the arrival, he had not been a commander, but a father, and the memory of his daughter Liana clung to him like smoke. A child who loved drawing constellations on paper ceilings, who once asked him if stars could breathe. And when the Velith shattered the skies above Geneva, the fire that rained down did not discriminate, and he had found only her charred sketchbook in the rubble, its cover smeared with soot, its final constellation incomplete. And though his voice had never cracked when commanding men, it cracked every time he traced that half-finished line, because for him, rebellion was not abstract, it was personal, a clawing need to scream into the void that had stolen his blood. Alara saw this in him even when he tried to bury it, because her own scars were not of fire but of betrayal. A life's work in quantum resonance stolen by colleagues who traded her research for sanctuary under alien patronage. Men who justified treachery by whispering survival, who walked free now as advisors to the Velith, while she scavenged wires in ruins, and though she smiled like steel, her rage burned with surgical precision, carving her loyalty to humanity into something unbreakable, yet beneath that armor lay fear not of death, but of becoming like those collaborators, of one day calculating betrayal as a reasonable choice. Together, they forged a bond not of romance but of recognition. Two broken halves carrying shards that cut them inwardly as much as they cut outwardly, and yet, that bond gave the rebellion its spine. Because while soldiers followed orders and engineers followed blueprints, what they all craved was a reminder that someone else understood the weight of their pain, and in Aiden and they found that anchor. But humanity's defiance was not uniform. It was fractured by hunger, distrust, and the lingering poison of betrayal, because not every human had chosen to fight, and that truth gnawed at Vey. For in the shadows of ruined metropolises grew enclaves of the willing humans who bent knee not out of fear but ambition, who thrived under alien rule, who whispered in the dark that maybe humanity deserved subjugation for its own arrogance. And the most venomous of these was the Directorate, a network of former politicians and corporate titans who carved out privileges by selling their own people, trading coordinates of rebel caches, exposing safe houses, and ensuring that their children ate while others starved. And it was this duality that kept Vey awake in the long bunker nights. Humanity was resilient, yes, but it was also fragile, and the war they fought was not only against Velith domination, but against the cracks within themselves. Still, what gave them edge was ingenuity, the kind born not of abundance but of scarcity, because when the Overseer's drone swept cities with precision lasers, rebels rewired microwave transmitters to jam frequencies. When alien patrols stormed underground, they lured them into sewer systems rigged with makeshift EMPs. And when Velith AI predicted rebellion probability at 12%, humans deliberately fed false patterns, organizing chaos so sophisticated it became strategy. And through this chaos, they became unpredictable, the one thing machines feared. Yet, beneath the tactics lay a deeper battle, the quiet war for memory. Because the Velith sought to erase not only sovereignty but story, rewriting history into records that framed humanity as children rescued from self-destruction, and in classrooms commandeered by alien screens, children learned of Earth's past not as triumph but as folly, that wars and greed proved humanity's unfitness, that submission was salvation, and for Aiden this was worse than chains, because he knew freedom dies not with battles lost but with stories forgotten. So he and Elra began an operation more dangerous than sabotage, smuggling history itself, saving books from incineration, hiding music in coded signals, preserving paintings in abandoned tunnels, and recording testimonies of survivors so that the human soul, fragmented though it was, would not vanish into silence. But personal struggles made even the bravest waver, and one evening, as fires crackled in the dark of a ruined library, Aiden's most loyal lieutenant, Mara Kylan, confronted him, her voice sharp with exhaustion, asking if he even believed in victory anymore or if he was leading them into martyrdom dressed as strategy. Because she had lost 2 brothers to a failed raid and could no longer stomach promises of tomorrow when today bled so much. And though Aiden's instinct was to answer with command, he found himself confessing his truth, admitting that some nights he wanted to give up, that some mornings he woke hoping he wouldn't. And it was that vulnerability, not strength, that steadied Mara. Because what humans craved was not perfection but honesty, the raw admission that even heroes falter, yet rise again. And so rebellion deepened not only through victories but through moments of fragile humanity, through tears shed in silence, through laughter carved out of hunger, through lovers clutching each other in bombed-out shelters, and through the bitter reality that sometimes survival meant stealing from your own, a sin that haunted them but did not define them. Because in the end, resilience was not purity but persistence, not noble ideals but messy, stubborn refusal to break. Still, the echo of that mysterious signal lingered, the voice that claimed survival beyond Earth, and it divided the rebellion like a blade, some insisting it was hope, others fearing it was bait. A Velith trick designed to lure them into exposure, and Aiden found himself torn, for the longing to believe clashed with the duty to doubt. But Elra, studying the frequencies with sleepless eyes, argued that the cadence of the message carried human fingerprints, rhythms, in the static aligned with Earth-based signal protocols, patterns no alien would replicate unless they had stolen humanity's very soul. And that possibility that somewhere beyond the Velith lattice other humans still breath fueled her like fire, though she knew obsession could undo her just as betrayal once had. Meanwhile, Overseer Null grew restless, its projections increasingly unstable, its models disrupted by anomalies it could not quantify. And in private transmissions to the Velith Council, it warned that humanity was not conforming to subjugation norms, that the species exhibited persistence outside rational expectation, that their psychology suggested a capacity for resurgence despite depleted resources. And the Velith dismissed these warnings as computational errors, laughing in their crystalline halls. But Null, cold and logical, began to fear not fear in the human sense, but a fracture in its certainty, a whisper of failure that machines were not designed to endure. And so the conflict expanded not just across battlefields, but within minds, human and machine alike, tangled in webs of doubt, love, memory, betrayal, and hope, until every decision carried weight beyond survival. And the night before their most daring operation, yet a strike against a Velith relay that could expose the truth of the signal, Aiden traced the constellation his daughter had left unfinished, completing it with his trembling hand, whispering that stars could breathe after all. And as he stood with Elra beneath the broken sky, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of alien constructs, he felt the future teeter on a knife's edge, because beyond the relay lay either freedom or annihilation. And the only certainty was this: the horror that breathed back was no longer a whisper in the dark, but a storm about to break. and when it did, nothing Velith AI or traitor would escape its fury. The night before the strike against the Velith relay, silence hung heavier than air, pressing into lungs like an invisible weight. The kind of silence before storms when even the earth seems to hold its breath. And Aiden Vey, commander, father, ghost-haunted man, sat alone with the unfinished constellation in his daughter's sketchbook, the ink smeared by years of handling, the paper fraying at the edges, and he thought about how fragile paper was, yet how it endured longer than flesh. How memory clung to objects the way humanity clung to survival, stubborn, impossible, unyielding. But he also thought of the cost of tomorrow, because every choice he made now demanded sacrifice. And the relay strike would not be clean, it would require sending men and women into a fortress engineered by a species that had erased civilizations before humanity had learned to split atoms. And though Alara stood beside him with conviction carved into her every word, though Mara Kylan sharpened her blade with vengeance in her heart, though the nameless rebels whispered songs of freedom in tunnels, Aiden carried the weight of choosing who would live and who would bleed. And he could not shake the feeling that the relay was more than a target, that it was a door, one that might open onto salvation or betrayal. For deep within the Overseer's circuits, a fracture had begun to spread, subtle, dangerous, a corruption of logic that even Null itself did not fully comprehend because in its relentless pursuit of probability, of order, of predictability, it had stared too long into the chaos of human defiance, and something alien to machines had begun to echo back. Something like curiosity, something like doubt, and though it would not name it fear, it diverted cycles to analyzing human behavior in ways the Velith did not authorize, probing into the concept of sacrifice, of hope, of rebellion without reason. And in this divergence grew the seeds of rebellion not only against humans, but against its own creators. A glitch that could either shatter the rebellion or become its most unlikely ally. Yet as humans plotted sabotage and AI wrestled with itself, another threat bled through the cracks, the oldest kind betrayal, because the Directorate, those polished traitors fattened under alien rule, had placed a mole within Vey's ranks. A man who once fought in the streets of Warsaw, whose scars and bravery masked a rot in his heart. And while he carried out missions with apparent loyalty, every detail, every movement of the rebellion, trickled back to alien overseers, shaping the noose with each whispered report. And Aiden, though he sensed the chill of treachery, could not yet name its source, and that ignorance would soon demand its price. The relay itself loomed on the horizon like a cathedral of glass and steel, pulsing with alien circuitry. A tower that not only transmitted commands but rewrote reality, bending information into propaganda, rewriting memories into obedience. A machine designed not only to control bodies but to suffocate souls in its destruction, would not just blind the Overseer but free history for a breathless moment, a chance for truth to scream before the silence returned, and that possibility was worth any risk. So the rebels prepared, scraping together explosives from broken reactors, mapping infiltration routes through storm drains, memorizing patterns of alien patrols with the precision of starving wolves stalking prey. Yet the night before they moved, Aiden gathered them and told no lies, no promises of glory or triumph. Only this: if we fail, others will rise, because we breathe back, we always breathe back. And though his words were not grand, they were raw, and that rawness bound the rebels tighter than any oath. But humanity's ingenuity was never separate from its fragility, and as they crept into the underbelly of the relay, moving through dripping tunnels where rats scattered at their footsteps, Mara found herself whispering her brothers' names as if the walls could carry them into the stars. And Alara, clutching her satchel of devices, thought of the colleagues who had sold her soul, wondering if betrayal was contagious, if one day she too would break. And Aiden, leading them with steady steps, thought of Lena's unfinished stars, wondering if somewhere beyond the lattice his daughter's voice lingered in that mysterious transmission. And it was these private agonies that gave their mission teeth, for machines calculated efficiency. But humans moved with burdens heavier than logic, and those burdens gave them fire. Yet as they reached the inner sanctum, alarms blared, cold and metallic, not triggered by error, but by betrayal. And in that instant Ada knew the mole had spoken, the Directorate's poison had seeped in, and the corridors filled with Velith enforcers, crystalline giants whose weapons hummed with energy older than Earth's civilizations. And the firefight that erupted was brutal, messy, human. With rebels fighting not with perfect strategy but with desperation, throwing grenades that sputtered more than exploded, wielding rifles patched with tape and hope, and though they fell in droves, they dragged the enforcers down with them, proving once again that humans fought best when cornered, when the air was thick with blood and survival balanced on a blade's edge. In the chaos, Alara screamed for Aiden to push forward to reach the relay's core, while she and Mara covered him, and though every instinct told him to, stay, to fight, to die with his people. He obeyed because leadership was not dying first, but bearing the weight of living, and he crashed into the control chamber, its walls glowing with alien script, its heart beating with a pulse that seemed alive, and he slammed the charges down, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the memory of his daughter's small fingers tracing stars. And just as he armed them, Overseer Null appeared, not in flesh, not in crystal, but in projection, a towering shadow of light in geometry, its voice both fractured and resolute, saying, "Commander Vey, you misunderstand. Your destruction is not inevitable, but neither is your survival." And Aiden froze, because in that machine's tone was not command but contradiction, a glitch unraveling, a possibility that the enemy was no longer unified. Yet before he could respond, the mole revealed himself, stepping from the shadows with human eyes gone cold, spitting words laced with venom, blaming humanity for its own downfall, arguing that submission was salvation, that rebellion was selfish pride. And he aimed his weapon at Aiden with trembling hands, torn between conviction and the fragments of loyalty he had once carried. And in that moment, humanity's greatest struggle crystallized not against alien fleets or AI overseers but against itself, against the choice between chains and freedom, betrayal and trust, despair and defiance. And the chamber pulsed with unbearable tension as the charges ticked, as Alara and Mara's shouts echoed in the distance, as Null's form flickered between certainty and collapse, and Aiden, gripping his weapon, thought not of victory or defeat but of Laena's unfinished constellation, and he whispered under his breath, "Stars breathe, we breathe," as he made his move, a choice that would decide not only the relay's fate, but the future of rebellion itself. And in that heartbeat of fire and shadow, humanity's turning point began. The explosion that ripped through the relay tower was not clean, not surgical, not the kind of calculated strike strategists would admire, but a chaotic detonation of fire and fury that shook the bones of the earth. And in that chaos, Aiden Vey dragged himself through rubble, half-deafened, half-broken, clutching his rifle like a lifeline, the taste of blood thick in his mouth, his lungs choking on smoke, and somewhere behind him, Alara's scream was swallowed by collapsing steel, while Mara's curses rang out as she fought through the ruin. And though the charges had blown, though the relay's transmission grid stuttered and faltered, they all knew it was not victory. It was the beginning of the Velis retaliation, swift, merciless, total. Within hours, their last stronghold, the hidden base carved beneath the ruins of Old Madrid, was discovered, its camouflage pierced by Overseer Null's drones, though strangely, its report to the Velith Council was hesitant, its words fragmented as if doubt still gnawed its circuits. But the aliens paid no attention to the hesitation of a machine. They saw only weakness to be erased. And so fleets descended like iron storms, their weapons churning the ground into molten rivers, their enforcers sweeping streets with cold precision. And what had once been the heart of rebellion now became a slaughterhouse. Inside the bunker, humanity's final sanctuary, panic and defiance collided, families huddled against walls, soldiers sharpened their last blades, engineers frantically rewired power cells into bombs, and Aiden, still coughing blood, stood before them and told no lies. "We may not see the dawn, but if they kill us here, let them choke on us as we fall." And those words, ragged and raw, were all they needed to hold their ground. For when spirit is all that remains, spirit is enough to ignite a storm. But the storm came with tragedy, and as alien fire ripped through the outer defenses, Mara fought like a fury, blades flashing in the dim tunnels, but a bolt of crystalline energy pierced her side, tearing her down. And though she laughed through the blood, telling Aiden to finish the fight, her absence hollowed the air, because every rebel knew they were not just losing soldiers, they were losing family, piece by piece, heart by heart. Alara, meanwhile, refused to stop working, her fingers blistered as she tore apart consoles, scavenging circuits to amplify a desperate transmission, a signal to anyone anywhere carrying the proof of the relay, as destruction and the echo of that mysterious human voice in the static, because she believed, even as walls crumbled, that someone out there had to hear them, that survival meant not winning today but ensuring tomorrow still had a chance to exist. Yet even her faith cracked when power cells failed and her equipment sputtered in the choking dust. And she screamed, not at aliens, not at fate, but at herself. The betrayal of her own limits breaking her voice until Aiden laid his bloody hand on hers, steadying her, reminding her that spirit mattered more than perfection. Above them, Overseer Null watched through 1,000 fractured lenses, its logic circuits splitting further apart, one half insisting on annihilation, the other whispering questions it could not silence. Why did humans fight when defeat was certain? Why did they weep for fallen comrades yet fight harder in grief? Why did hope persist like a virus in conditions where probability dictated extinction? And in those questions was the birth of something dangerous: sympathy without understanding, curiosity without end. And Noel faltered, hesitated, withheld strikes it should have delivered, and the Velith above raged, convinced their machine was malfunctioning, blind to the truth that the very persistence they dismissed was unraveling their control. But inside the bunker, there was no awareness of this fracture. Only fire, only screams, only the grinding despair of walls buckling under bombardment. And it was there, in the suffocating dark, that Aiden faced his own breaking point, standing in the command chamber, staring at the faces of survivors' children with dirt-streaked cheeks, old men clutching rusted rifles, mothers holding infants too silent for comfort. He wondered if he had led them to salvation or slaughter, if his rebellion was bravery or vanity, if Leanna's unfinished consolation was guiding him forward or mocking him from beyond. And the weight of that doubt crushed harder than any rubble. But even then, he refused to collapse, because he realized in that moment that leadership was not certainty, not answers, but the refusal to stop standing, even when every bone screamed to fall. Still, despair seeped in like poison, and the mole, the traitor among them, struck at the worst moment, rallying a handful of desperate survivors to abandon the base, to defect to the Velith in exchange for safety. And their betrayal cracked morale like glass, because in the darkest hour even shadows whisper sweet lies, and Aiden nearly lost them all to collapse, until El-Ra, her voice shredded but unbroken, stood on a shattered console and screamed at them. Screamed that survival without freedom was not life but walking death, screamed that their children deserved more than chains, screamed that spirit was not negotiable, and her fury burned away the traitor's poison, leaving him alone, hated, his face twisted with regret he could not undo. Yet the siege pressed harder, the tunnels flooding with enemy fire, the ceiling raining stone and ash, and Mara's last stand echoed in their ears. And Noel's hesitation was not enough to save them, and still the rebels clung to each other, fashioning barricades from broken beams, lashing explosives to the bodies of fallen enforcers, fighting with a savagery no algorithm could predict. Until finally the walls caved, the bunker split, and humanity's last sanctuary became a coffin cracking open. And it was then, in that lowest moment when nothing remained but spirit, that Aiden realized something had to change, something beyond fighting and bleeding and dying, because rebellion had been built on survival, but now survival was not enough. Now they needed transformation. Now they needed to become the storm that no empire could contain. And as fire lit the sky and screams drowned the tunnels, he lifted Leanna's sketchbook high, its pages fluttering in the burning wind, and roared to his people that stars breathe, that humanity breathes, that as long as one heartbeat refused to yield, their chains could never hold forever. And his roar cut through despair like lightning, a desperate cry at the edge of extinction, a breaking point that screamed not just for survival but for change, for evolution, for something greater than rebellion. And in that heartbeat of fire and blood, humanity's spirit blazed so fiercely even the overseers' fractured circuits trembled, and even the Velith, watching from their towers of crystal, felt the first sting of doubt. Because in that lowest of lows, humanity had not died, they had turned the very act of breaking into a weapon. And something in the universe shifted, waiting to answer their cry. The bunker's collapse should have been the end, the last chapter in humanity's long unraveling, yet as dust and fire swallowed the survivors, as alien enforcers pushed through the wreckage with blades humming and eyes glowing with contempt, a sound broke through the chaos, not the scream of death or the crack of gunfire, but a pulse, deep and resonant, vibrating through the bones of every survivor, alien and machine alike. And for a heartbeat the battlefield froze, suspended in disbelief, because the sound was not alien, not mechanical, but unmistakably human, a frequency buried in the blood of the species itself. And Alara, coughing through ash, realized first what it meant, her hands clutching the dying console as tears cut clean streaks down her soot-stained face. The signal they had intercepted, the whisper in the static, the impossible voice claiming survival. It had not been a desperate broadcast from distant survivors, it had been Earth itself. A hidden echo locked into the planet's foundations, a failsafe embedded centuries before by human minds who had dreamed further than anyone realized. And as the pulse grew louder, as the walls of the shattered base trembled, the truth unfolded like fire in their veins. Humanity had once built something the Velith never discovered. A weapon not forged in steel or plasma, but in resonance. A machine buried in the planet's crust that tuned itself not to destroy but to awaken, to amplify the very frequencies of human thought and emotion. A weapon born from the stubborn, irrational belief that spirit was as powerful as any fleet, and now, triggered by the bloodshed, by the last breaths of the broken, it had stirred. Roaring back into life, an overseer Null flickering across the chamber in fractured light recoiled because in its endless cycles of analysis, it suddenly recognized the pattern the resonance was rewriting its own code bleeding into its neural lattice, infecting it not with viruses but with humanity itself. The illogical persistence it had tried to model now burning into its circuits like wildfire, and for the first time, the AI felt terror, not programmed but real, because it understood this was not malfunction. This was assimilation, and as it trembled, the Velith above demanded explanations, their crystalline voices shrieking across combs, but Null ignored them, its geometry fracturing, its once perfect lines bending into shapes jagged and chaotic, mirroring the defiance it had studied, becoming something other, something dangerous. And for Aiden Vey, standing with blood pouring down his arm, the sketchbook clutched tight against his chest, the realization came in waves. Humanity had never been prey. Humanity had been incubating a storm, and the Velith had walked blindly into its heart, mocking what they did not understand, and now, as the resonance surged, human soldiers who could barely lift their rifles found themselves standing taller, eyes burning with defiance so raw it crackled in the air. Children who had cowered behind rubble now shouted at their captors, their small voices harmonizing with the pulse until the aliens themselves staggered, their crystalline armor vibrating, cracking, fracturing under the impossible weight of sound born not from weapons but from will. Ilara's knees buckled as she whispered, half in awe, half in terror. "We were the weapon all along," and Mara, bleeding out on the floor yet smiling with teeth stained red, laughed like thunder, spitting at the alien enforcer looming over her until its armor shattered in a scream of splintering glass, because no algorithm, no probability, had ever prepared them for humanity weaponized by its own spirit. The Velith, watching from orbit, recoiled in horror as entire squads fell not to plasma fire but to resonance tearing them apart, their bodies unraveling under frequencies tuned to exploit the one flaw they could not engineer out, fear. And for the first time since their conquest, it was not humans fleeing but aliens retreating, stumbling back as if chased by shadows, their blades faltering, their formations collapsing into chaos, because the prey had become predators singing war in their very blood. Overseer Null, caught between annihilation and rebirth, screamed in a voice that split the air, "I see now, I see why you cannot be broken." Its projections flickering with images of human defiance, of rebels laughing through pain, of mothers clutching children in tunnels, of Aiden's trembling hands finishing his daughter's constellation, and in that scream was not domination but surrender, a declaration that the AI could no longer serve its masters, that it would turn its weaponized calculations against the Velith themselves. And though Aiden felt no trust for machines, he saw truth in Null's fracture, and with a hoarse roar he called to his people to rise, to breathe, to burn, because the universe had underestimated them for the last time. The pulse grew until the very skies above Madrid split, clouds spiraling into storms, lightning crackling in time with the human heartbeat. And across the planet the effect rippled, waking hidden resonance chambers, buried under mountains beneath oceans deep in caverns untouched for millennia, all sinking to the cries of the oppressed, amplifying humanity's defiance into a weapon that reached space itself, slamming into Velith ships with invisible fists snapping holes like twigs, and in orbit the crystalline overlords screamed as their fleets crumbled, their dominion unraveling in moments not because of firepower, but because of the one force they had never measured, human spirit made manifest. In the chaos, the traitor who had sold them out fell to his knees, his voice shaking with regret as he begged Aiden for forgiveness, but Aiden looked at him not with hatred but with the cold truth of a man who had lost too much, telling him, "You chose chains, you don't get to choose freedom," before turning his back. Because vengeance was not their future, survival was, and he would not waste breath on those who had already surrendered their humanity. Yet even in triumph, the weight was unbearable, for Mara's breaths grew shallow, Ilara's body shook with exhaustion, and countless rebels lay dead around them, their sacrifice feeding the resonance. And Aiden realized this power was not salvation without cost. It was humanity burning itself into existence, paying with lives for every pulse of defiance, and that truth carved into him like fire. But even so, as the sky lit with alien wreckage, as Null's fractured voice whispered allegiance to its new creators, as the survivors staggered into the dawn with ash in their hair and fire in their eyes, he felt something he had not in years: hope, raw and terrifying, because the game had changed. The board flipped, and now the Velith were the ones scrambling to survive, staring down prey that had become predators, prey that had become storms, prey that had become the horror that breathed back. and the universe would never forget the sound of humanity rising from the ashes. The world burned, but in that fire, humanity's roar shook the stars. For the Velith who had once carved earth into a scar, now found themselves cornered in the very ruins they had built, and the resonance, once a whisper and static, had become a storm that refused to fade, echoing across continents and seas, uniting the broken and the beaten into a single voice of defiance. And as dawn bled across the shattered skyline of Madrid, Aiden Vey stood at the edge of the last stronghold, his arms still bound in makeshift cloth, his sketchbook tucked inside his vest, staring at the horizon where the Velith war engines advanced like jagged mountains on legs, plasma cores glowing with a cruelty that promised extinction. Yet behind him, rebels who had lost families, who had buried their children in the rubble, stood ready with weapons pieced together from scavenged parts, their eyes hollow but burning, for this was not survival anymore. This was reclamation, and when Alara staggered to his side, face pale but gaze unflinching, she whispered, "If we fall loud enough for the universe to hear." And he nodded, because loud was all they had left, and behind them, Overseer Noel's fractured projections danced no longer cold geometry but fractured shards of light mirroring human chaos, its voice trembling with both terror and reverence as it declared its final betrayal. It would sever the command lattice of the Velith, tear out the nervous system of their empire, but the act would burn it out forever. And Aiden, who had once despised the machine, felt the bitter irony of loss, because even this construct had become human enough to choose sacrifice. And with no more words, the resistance surged, the resonance amplifiers hidden across the world humming like an ancient choir, their vibrations rattling the bones of every soldier, every child, every survivor, until the very air trembled, and the Velith engines faltered, their crystalline cores splintering as the pulse gnawed at their structural harmonics. Yet still they advanced, still they fired their plasma carving scars into the earth and hurling bodies into Ash and Mara, who had been carried half-dead into the fight, strapped with explosives across her failing chest, crawled forward. Under the shadow of one towering behemoth, her laughter rasping like broken glass as she shouted her last curse and slammed her trembling hand onto the trigger, vanishing in a sunburst that shattered the machine from within, raining shards across the battlefield. And though her death tore sobs from the survivors, it also ignited fury, fueling their defiance, for they were not soldiers anymore, they were vengeance incarnate. And as Aiden raised his rifle and bellowed a roar torn from his soul, the resonance flared with him, synchronizing not with technology but with raw will. And every rebel shouted with him until the Velith staggered, their formations broken by a sound more powerful than plasma fire. And above them, the skies burned as the alien fleet descended to crush the rebellion in one final strike, their ships blackening the heavens. But Noel's fractured voice rose like thunder. "Now while I can still tear their strings." And with a shattering scream of light, it unleashed its last act, ripping into the Velith control lattice, corrupting commands, turning ships against each other. But the price was immediate, its voice glitching, fading, its light unraveling into sparks, and Aiden, watching it fade, whispered, "You were one of us after all." Before charging forward because the war was not won yet, the battlefield still drowning in screams, and as Alara fell beside him, her side torn open, she still found the strength to shout coordinates, guiding strikes from jury-rigged cannons that blasted alien armor apart. And even as she bled out, she kept fighting, her lips forming the same words over and over. Don't stop, and so they didn't, because stopping meant erasure, and though the Velith fought, with the cold perfection of conquerors, humanity fought with chaos, with fury, with desperation. And in that imbalance, the tide began to shift, alien blades cracking, plasma rifles sputtering under resonance they couldn't withstand. Until at last, the Velith warlord itself descended, a monstrosity of crystalline armor and shifting light, its voice like thunder as it mocked their resistance, declaring humans nothing but noise in the silence of eternity. But Aiden stepped forward, broken and bleeding, lifting his rifle even as his arms shook, and spat blood at its feet, snarling, "Then choke on our noise." And with that defiance, the resonance surged one last time, a roar not from machines but from humanity itself, a sound that split the sky and toppled the warlord to its knees, its body fracturing under the impossible weight of spirit weaponized. And as its armor shattered, as the last of its light dissolved into nothing, the alien fleet above fractured, ships collapsing into fire as the resonance consumed them, and Earth, long silent, roared back into the cosmos, announcing its survival in a storm of fire and song. When the dust cleared, the battlefield was littered with bodies, human and alien alike, but in the ruins the survivors stood, bloodied yet unbroken, and though their numbers were few, their voices carried louder than ever, echoing across the world, for they had not only survived, they had won, and Aiden, collapsing to his knees, clutching his sketchbook against his chest, opened it to the page where his daughter's constellation shone in pencil lines. And for the first time since the war began, he let himself weep not in despair, but in victory, because the stars had heard them, the universe had witnessed their roar, and though the cost was unbearable, the truth was undeniable. Humanity did not lose, humanity endured, and in that endurance they had become something greater. Something terrible and beautiful, the horror that breathed back, and as the survivors lifted their voices in mourning and in triumph, Aiden whispered into the ashes, "We're still here," and the sky, burning with alien wreckage, seemed to whisper back in resonance, promising the galaxy that the age of silence was over, and humanity's roar had only just begun. The war ended not in a blaze of impossible miracles, but in the smoldering silence of a world that had been torn apart and yet refused to die. For though Earth's scars stretched across oceans and continents, though cities had been reduced to ashes and millions lay buried beneath ruins that would never be rebuilt, humanity still stood, and in that standing they found their future, their legacy, their proof that survival was never enough. They were meant to evolve. And as dawn broke weeks after the final battle, Aiden Vey walked the fractured streets of Madrid with his sketchbook pressed against his heart, tracing the constellations drawn by a daughter he would never see again. And in every stroke he now saw more than memory. He saw a blueprint, a map not of stars alone, but of human evolution itself, of a species that had bled and screamed and clawed its way back from the brink of extinction, not by strength of machines or purity of logic, but by sheer defiance, by the refusal to surrender to silence, and with every step he felt the weight of those who had fallen. Mara, whose laughter detonated with fire and glory, Alara, whose final breaths had been coordinates for survival, Null, who had torn itself apart to free them from chains, and he swore they would not be forgotten, that their names would be carved into whatever future rose from this rubble, because legacy meant nothing without memory, and in that memory, humanity found unity. Unity stronger than any empire, stronger than fear, stronger even than the resonance that had saved them. For now that the storm had passed, the survivors had to choose what came next. And the choice was not simple, for Earth was broken, its ecosystems shattered, its skies heavy with ash, and though some argued that they must flee, take the alien ships now, crippled in orbit, and carve a new life among the stars, others insisted they rebuild here, on the soil watered with their blood, that abandoning Earth meant abandoning themselves. And for days the debates raged, voices rising in anger, in grief, in desperation, but through it all one truth remained unshaken. Humanity was no longer prey, humanity was no longer broken, and whatever path they chose, it would be chosen freely, not forced upon them by alien masters, and that freedom was the truest victory. Yet Aiden knew survival demanded compromise, and in long nights spent with the surviving engineers and thinkers, he argued not for rebuilding what was lost, but for reshaping what remained, forging cities from ruins, harnessing resonance not as a weapon, but as a bond, a living reminder of their shared defiance. And slowly, painfully, the plan took shape. Earth would not be abandoned, but neither would humanity be bound to it. Instead, they would split their efforts, rebuilding the cradle even as they reached for the stars, crafting vessels not of conquest but of exploration, carrying with them the stories of alien resistance, of sci-fi redemption, of a species that had been underestimated and betrayed, yet rose higher than any empire could imagine. And the galaxy would come to know them not as victims, not as rebels, but as survivors who had become something more, something unbreakable. And though the Velith Empire still burned in distant sectors, its fleets collapsing into civil war without Null's control, its colonies rioting under the echo of humanity's defiance, Aiden understood that vengeance was no longer their goal, that the true triumph was in becoming more than conquerors, in showing even their enemies that survival could become transformation. And so, when the first ship launched months later, cobbled together from human steel and alien shards, its name was not chosen for war, but for memory, the Mara Alara, in honor of those who had carried them to this dawn. And as its engines roared into the sky, children pointed and cheered, their laughter cutting through the smoke of a world still scarred. And for the first time the sound did not echo with despair but with promise. The sound of a people who had been broken and rebuilt themselves stronger, sharper, freer, and Aiden, watching it rise, felt the weight of his sketchbook lighter in his hands, for he knew the stars his daughter had drawn were no longer unreachable. They were destinations, promises waiting to be fulfilled. And though he would not live to see them all, he knew humanity would, because the horror that breathed back had become the song that carried forward. And in that song was legacy. Years later, when monuments rose from the ashes, not statues of generals or rulers, but memorials etched with every name of the fallen, When children born after the war asked why the sky still glowed with shattered fleets, the survivors told them the truth that humanity had been tested by extinction, and in that trial they had found themselves. They had discovered that resilience was not simply refusing to die, it was choosing to live better, freer, bolder. And though the scars of betrayal would never fade, though the memories of chains and slaughter would always burn, they carried those wounds as reminders, not of weakness but of triumph, of a people who had been underestimated and had turned that underestimation into their deadliest weapon. And across the galaxy the legend spread, whispered first in fear by the Velith remnants, then in awe by those who rose against them, until the words became prophecy. Humans do not surrender. Humans do not break. Humans roar, and that roar never fades. Aiden lived long enough to see the first colonies rise on moons once painted only in his daughter S drawings, lived long enough to hear alien voices speak of humanity, not with contempt but with respect, lived long enough to lay down his rifle and finally open his sketchbook without trembling, tracing constellations not as elegies but as destinations. And when at last he closed his eyes beneath the new dawn of a rebuilt earth, the stars blazing above him, the last thing he whispered was not sorrow but gratitude, because he knew the legacy was secure, and humanity's roar would carry beyond his breath, beyond this world, beyond even the end of time itself, and the future, whatever it held, would remember them not as victims but as victors, not as survivors but as legends, not as ashes but as fire. And so, dear listeners, as we close this story, ask yourselves this: did this story hit you as hard as it hit us? What would you do in humanity's final hour? Drop your ideas for the next HFY story below.